Hello again. I hope you are enjoying our series on finding God in the midst of really tough life intersections and discovering truths about yourself and maybe even those closest to you. In part one, if you recall, we spoke to people about their faith in the middle of mental health crises and the injustice they often encountered from others. In part two, we will now narrow our focus to the inside of the church. The church. This is the place where we maintain that humanity is elevated, where the holiness of the individual is supposed to be affirmed. As Christians, we speak about being loved and accepted by God. So we must love and accept one another. And yet, as our speakers attest, as I can attest, as many of you can attest, it is within the church that some of our deepest shame has been experienced. We felt this needed to be brought into the light and addressed if we were going to do this topic any justice. In this video, we mostly speak about the Christian church as if it were one entity. The various denominations are rarely mentioned. We like to think that some of the harm described did not occur in the United Church of Christ, but realistically, we also know that the UCC is not immune from it. We do know that our denomination holds itself open to scrutiny and correction, and in that spirit, we are putting forth these experiences. Whether in large ways or small, but terribly cutting ways, we can all do harm. And we can all learn better how to be an extension of God's love in this place we call the church. In this first clip, listen to how Reverend Dr. J.J. Flagg, who navigates life from a wheelchair, talks about his sense of identity as derived from the messages he received from the church. How would you say the church has lived up to and also let you down in terms of your identity and intersectionality?
How has the church lived up to and let me down as far as my identity and intersectionality? So on one hand, the church has done a lot to form and shape who I am and the way that I understand myself in relation to God and in relation to the rest of humanity, right? But in many ways, the church, while it was a place of formation and life giving in many aspects, it was a place that I would say caused the greatest hurt in my life. And when I say that, what I mean is the church was the first place that I ever really wrestled with being disabled. I never knew I I didn't know that I was different from other people as far as being in a chair until I got to the church and people told me that me being in a chair was evidence that I didn't have enough faith, or um, or that in order for me to be healed, uh, I needed to stir my faith up more, or that me being in a chair was proof that either there was sin in my life or sin in my family's life, and my being disabled was the tangible evidence that God was holding somebody responsible for the sin. While the church has done so much to shape the way that I understand the way God relates with the world and the way that I relate with other people, and this call to preach justice and love and all of these things, on the other hand, the church was also the place that I began to see myself differently, uh, in a lens that I had never encountered until I came into the church. I never really saw myself being called to ministry because I couldn't do what everybody else did. Um, and the more I tried to go in another direction, the more God pulled me right back. And so my life has been, I would say, uh, a story of just wrestling with reimagining my own place in the world and reimagining what it looks like to just be authentically me and not the carbon copy of somebody else.
It is heartbreaking to realize that JJ and others never look at themselves as less than or impaired until the church tells them that they are. How did we get here? How did those ministers and Christians stray so far from God's delight in God's own created diversity? What happened inside? Who knows? Who knows what would have been so helpful to JJ in those moments, or his family when they were being judged? If we ever find ourselves thinking that we are speaking for God by letting someone know that they need healing from who or what they are, I'll tell you a secret. It is guaranteed that we are the deluded ones in need of change. And yet this sentiment is so predominant inside of the church. Listen now to Reverend Rena Ramos as she describes the difference between oppression theology in her Baptist church versus liberating theology as she came out of the closet. And while she finds freedom in the big area of her sexuality within the United Church of Christ, listen to the personal ignoring, the outright sense of other she is subjected to during one significant ride in the elevator, all because of the color of her skin. Take it away, Raina.
So the idea of God of the 80s is the idea of a God of justice. It's the idea that faith does something to eliminate oppression, because that's what I was being taught, that the God that I grew up Catholic, that the God that was being preached was a God of liberation. And so then, strangely enough, when I came to the United States and I started attending a Baptist church, my God became a God of submission. And I learned how to be quiet. And I learned how to repress myself as a lesbian. And I learned how to just forgive, because that's what God taught us to do, and to forgive even oppression. And so it wasn't until I came out of the closet that my God became a liberating God again. Mm-hmm. So it has gone through different ways of expressions of the divine. Yeah.
Yeah. So even as you've come to identify yourself and you've come to find more of a place here in this country, are there ever still moments where you feel the microaggressions or the macroaggressions?
All the time. All the time. And I'm just lucky I live in the bubble of Oakland, California, where there is more diversity. Mm-hmm. And it's not Long Island, New York, where people are still a little bit more segregated and it's a suburb. And so being in Oakland, California helps me to breathe a little bit more easy. But sometimes in the context of the United Church of Christ, that tends to be more white. When I have gone to meetings of the annual conference here in Northern California, I've been invisible in those places. Mm-hmm. And, I remember a time where I went to one of those meetings and I ride an elevator, and everybody in the elevator who was white were introducing themselves to each other, and nobody reached out to introduce themselves to me. And it was 4 people in the elevator, and they all got out of the elevator knowing who they were because they thought themselves in participants of the conference, but I was wearing my badge. So I was a participant too. I needed it to be acknowledged. Yeah. And so it is stink, it is like, give me a puncher, a reminder, oh, you are an outsider. you don't belong here. But I bounce back much easier now than I used to. It used to be really devastating to be the other. And now I'm like, oh, they're lost. They don't know how interesting I am. They will to sit down to me. I have so many stories to tell them.
I love the truth that Reverend Rena came to. I believe she said that I am so interesting. In other words, there are those who are losing out on her being interesting. This is God making her way through the harm that the church has caused and speaking directly to Reverend Rena about her own beauty. Reverend James Triplett, our next minister, seems to come from a place of reckoning about the church that upheld them for 37 years. They wonder whether the church is even a safe environment anymore. Sadly, their conclusion will reveal that the church is not living in its finest hour. In fact, if this is the church, who needs enemies?
I don't even know if they were called microaggressions. One of the things that is well known in the conservative circles is they're going to let you know how they feel.
But then they're going to say, bless your heart
Bless your,
at the
especially
end
down
of it,
south.
and then everything's okay.
Especially
Everything's
down south.
okay.
They be like, "Ooh, bless your heart."
Yeah, bless your heart. You look horrible today, but bless your heart.
I don't know.
Yes.
And you have to learn how to discern and interpret what they're really saying, right? And that's a difference over here in the progressive circles, because people usually say, very strategic things. Yet they may not tell you what they really feel like, because that is not conducive for that situation. So when I walked in churches, and mind you, the most aggression I felt was when I was not even practicing being gay. I was in a heteronormative relationship. Because I gave my testimony, I was very open about my sexuality and about my struggle. People doubted me just like they doubted God. So I was married. We were working. I was confessing. We were accountable to each other. And people always thought that I was still gay. And so I lost positions. I had leaders, community leaders, bishops and apostles and prophets, these church titles attack me as one who was just what we call a minister, which was beginning into ministry. We used a mentorship program, as you know. They would change the sermons when I walk into the room. They would not honor me in the position in which they've given me. They would use me and then not ordain me. And so that was normal for me. I had to steel myself, had to make myself strong to walk into churches, because churches will literally shift. People will literally look at me. And service will almost stop if I walk into the room, because I'm big, because I have this silver in my hair that everybody thinks I put it in there, but it's a natural thing, and I'm conservative.
They think that?
Oh yes, I've had so many questions. Did you put that in your head? No. Why? I don't. Why? I've had it since I was 12, and you've known me since I was 12. Like, all of those things. And it's because of the ignorance. It's because of how Scripture is preached. It's because of the binary thought process of the church, and the fact that we don't want to repent and turn away and go further into the places of the unknown, because we're not used to that. But since I come from trauma and come from brokenness, it is familiar for me to go back into the place to figure out the uncomfortability of not knowing the answer until I find the answer.
Yeah. Now, going with that, you're saying you coming out of brokenness and coming out of trauma, what mental health things stemmed from that and might you still be dealing with at this point from that?
From the coming out of trauma or the trauma?
Well, both and please, any way you want to answer that.
My goodness. Coming out of the trauma right now is the current heaviest journey. It is a tearing. It is a divorce. It's a divorce. I've taught the reason why God despised or hated divorce is because if two souls become one, to tear one soul into two is to create murder. It is to cause death. And my divorce from my ex-wife, even though it was because of my sexuality, caused another tearing, another rejection, another a place where it's like nobody really wants me, right? Because you get that from you tear away. And what I'm feeling, I become this spiritual refugee right now, because I'm fleeing from my terror, and fleeing from my terror leads me to places that is more liberal, more progressive. And the religions of this progressive place are more mainline and not Protestant, evangelical, church that I've come from. So in order for me to be healthy, hear me well, I actually have to deal with the place in which created the trauma in the first place. I have to be willing to leave the church to find my healing. Right? The same thing that has not, and this is the amazing part. The thing that has sustained me to my 37 years now is the very thing that I need to divorce. The very thing that I need to let go. Because it has served its purpose. And for me to carry that into this spirit will cause death. What was life now becomes death because it is not meant to be in this place.
Let's imagine a church community, mature enough in faith that Minister James does not have to leave, but rather they experience being embraced. Going further, let's picture a church that runs toward the suffering and dares to sit with the contradictions and the discomfort. I'm having a hard time. Can you? Of course, no one wants to feel abandoned. No one wants to feel the dark night of the soul. And most certainly, no one wants to feel lost without any way out. But the truth is, we are all somewhere along that continuum. And maybe we know that deep down. Yeah, we know that deep down, that we are all somewhere along that continuum, and we don't like it. So we push away the people who make us think about our own despair. Reverend David Hosey tells us that God's presence and the sense of God's absence are two sides of the same moment, the same breath. Just like walking a labyrinth. I know you know the labyrinth outside of the church. We all have them. The furthest out that you are, the closer you may be to the center. Crazy how that works. Instead of being afraid, we should embrace the company of those with mental health struggles. You know, they actually point us into the heart of God.
In part because the psych ward is such a complicated place and different people have such different experiences of it, which is true of church
Thank
too,
you. You
right?
just said it. That's yes. The church is a psych ward. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, and that can mean that the church is a place of safe sanctuary for folks where we can be ourselves and be ourselves at our most honest and vulnerable and share our most painful experiences. And for some people, for a lot of people throughout history, the psych ward and the church have both been sites of oppression or of violence or of abuse, right? The history of psychiatric institutions in our country and around the world is hardly a shining banner of humanitarianism, right? And so Christ is present within all of that complexity, right? I both believe it's true that Christ is present when we are able to sit in a circle and share who we are before each other and before God, and that Christ is present in a very particular way amidst pain and violence and abuse, saying, like, this is not God, right? So this, like, whatever this is not God. So there's, it's a complex image, I think. But I end Christ on the Psych Ward, the book, with an image of the labyrinth, and of, the labyrinth is this walking meditation, and you walk through, and when you think you're close to the center, you suddenly turn and find yourself all the way on the outside, and then you're the farthest from the center you think you can get, and suddenly you're there. You turn the corner and you're at the center, and you rest in the center for a while, and God is there. But then you leave, right? Then you leave and you go back out into the world, and God is there too. And so I think of sanctuary as that, right? Of like, we come in, we release, we sit there and discover the presence of God, and then we leave, and we're somehow more in tune to the fact that, like, oh, God's been out there all along. Actually, like, if God hasn't just been sort of sitting in here waiting for me, right? So there's complexity there, I think, and the calling we have as people of faith is in the midst of that complexity. I think that God sees us as whole, even when our experiences are of fragmentation. So I think that God is guiding us through a labyrinth, even when we are experiencing life as a maze. And holding those two things in tension with each other is so important in the work of ministry alongside people with mental health challenges, because both things are true, right? And holding those two things in tension with each other is so important in the work of ministry alongside people with mental health challenges, because both things are true, right? So, like, one way to say it would be, it is both true that God is present with people in the midst of their suffering, and true that people sometimes feel like they've been abandoned by God, and they're allowed to say that, right?
Right.
Which
Right.
the church is sometimes uncomfortable with, but the Bible is super comfortable with, right? I mean, the Psalms are just chock full of sacred texts saying,
Right.
hey,
So why
God,
don't you show up? Right. Yes. Yeah.
now would be a good time to show up.
Oh my God! Please let that be your third book. It's passive aggressive prayers by the
all those
psalmist.
promises you made, like,
Dave
I would
Finnegan
hate for
hosted.
your enemies to, like, think
I
badly
will write
about
it
you
forward.
because of what's happening to me here.
Yes.
Like, passive aggressive prayers, to God. And then, Jesus cries out from the cross, here's this central moment of the Christian faith, and Jesus says, God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Right? So our sacred texts are, like, super comfortable with the idea that both of these things, they don't contradict each other. They are, in fact, like, somehow one and the same movement in God's eyes. And so we have to have the space for that in our conversations, because on the one hand, I very much believe that God is present and loving and caring for people who, like me, suffer from some extreme mental health challenges. And also, like, I don't always have to like say that or be happy, or that doesn't have to be the first thing that I say to somebody who's suffering, because that might not be the thing they need to hear in that moment, right? What they might need to hear is like, that sounds really hard, right? That sounds really painful. Sometimes being able to sit with the felt experience of God's absence is what actually allows us to be witnesses to the presence of God.
We will now hear from Reverend Wei Orin. He is queer and has a severe hearing loss. He shares his anguish and heartbreak while grappling with so-called healers and leaders in the church who confuse their ego and the need for dramatic visuals with God's divine work. Listen for the moments where he leans towards a bigger Christianity than what's actually being pushed upon him. Talk about faith.
I do want to shift for a little moment and ask you more so about mental health. And I want to ask you sort of, how has the intersectionality, how has your living with a disability and your owning your queerness, how has that affected your mental health?
I sometimes, for a period of time, I do not feel I'm a quote unquote normal person or the perfect human being. I do not feel I'm a complete person. Oh, it's a struggle for me. That when I was young, lots of my Christian friends, they always encourage me to attend the quote unquote hearing, worship, the special person who has spiritual power. They can just solve all the problem. I was encouraged by them. Some of them just want to sit next to me, even try to play for me. And I feel I'm really sick at that time, in some sort, mentally or physically, especially when the pastor asks me, asks everyone, lay your hands up above the petition, you need to be healed. And it's my ear. I could put it here and pray with me. I to pray with them. And the pastor always say, have enough strong faith and you will be healed by God. You feel the Holy Spirit right now is with you. I just keep praying and cry. And the pastor will say, okay, right now, put down your hand and you can hear now. And to put it out. No, I still the same. I cannot hear from this ear still. And the pastor or my friend, they will say, oh, maybe you do not have enough faith. And come back again next week. And I did go back next week, but still the same. I do not feel well. I'm not loved by God. And one of the sister, just an elder sister, I respect her. And she walked to me. She said to me, oh, you have some physical problem and you are not a normal person. She mean the gender identity. And you need to have faith and pray to God. I also can pray for you. And you will be loved by God. You won't be condemned by God. I do not feel I'm loved by the community. I feel I'm not only physically ill, I'm mentally ill as well. I have lots of questions by myself, my faith. I do not feel God is a loving God. I feel I'm very wronged, especially that I'm from a Buddhist family. They will say, oh, the Buddhist, your family still worship the devil. So there are some kind of connection between you and your family and your religion. I just feel confused.
Yeah. So You said now though that you are Christian. You identify as Christian. How did that shift happen from feeling like God didn't love you to now being able to say, I identify as Christian?
I think it also go back to my mom. My mom said that in her belief, in her Buddhist belief, she believed that everyone had a particular path for themselves, but they just need time to figure out what's that path. The path, the journey of your life, your belief, your faith, or the partner you want to choose. I also learned from some very few old pastors. They say that Christianity should not be so tiny. So tiny. Outside this is not Christianity. It's not right. The God created the whole universe. We only through this tiny thing to know God. But there are lots of different perspectives to know God. And that's the first beginning for my deconstruction journey. I just try to deconstruct all my Christian belief, not only from this perspective.
What gives you the strength to still share even when you're uncomfortable?
Yeah, it will be a really long story, but
Okay.
I think it's an important story for me because that story pushed me on this journey. It was in 2008 that my former minister, her name is Ya Huiyang, that she committed suicide. Yeah, she was a minister of my church, LGBT church. She committed suicide. That there are different reasons. One of the reasons is that after she left my congregation, no other churches want to hire her. They said to her that because you just the pastor of the LGBT church, we cannot hire you. And that she committed suicide and she do not leave lots of words behind her. I attend her funeral. And at the funeral, I do feel so sad because some of her colleagues just say that, not directly, she must be punished by God. So,
And what in your faith tells you that that's not true?
I feel love from her. Every time when I talk to her, I do feel it's love just keep surrounding me.
Yeah.
And she seldom tell anyone about who against her, who just treat her badly because of her ministry. And at the funeral, I do feel I need to do something. And that's the very beginning of my journey. I need to just stand out to share my story.
Wow. This rocks me to my core. In the midst of shame and rejection, a shame and rejection that was so consuming that Wayren's colleague took her own life. He is still able to see through the church-driven judgment into the actual heart of his friend. It's apparent he knew who and what she was. She was love. And because she was love, she lives on in the inspired mission wherein has to speak out against the injustice and the hate that he is continually called to speak against. which means that she is love. Now, you'll have to forgive me. I'm a pastor. I'm a reverend. Sometimes things escape me. This story, it just feels like there's one that this is familiar with. Oh, God. Oh, right. Jesus. Of course. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and also Jesus on the cross. How so? What do you mean, how so? In the midst of religious leaders' scorn and calls to Jesus to perform a miracle of his own deliverance, Jesus was weak, lonely, and despairing. I'd go so far as to say that in today's language, we might have said Jesus was clinically depressed, feeling helpless, anxious, and confused. Though Jesus reached out to his fellow sufferers on the cross, on both sides, with compassion, it was in this hopeless state that he still died. You know, that's a behavior frequently observed with people with mental health challenges. Their ability to have compassion despite their current circumstance. And unfortunately, too many of us have to still die in a hopeless state. But even unto death, what exploded forth was a movement of zealous and zealots for God, unlike the world has ever known. They were propelled by a single flame: love. Jesus was love. Jesus' love was made manifest in his mental and physical suffering. Jesus is love. You know what? I'm going to say that we all have our Jesus people and even our Jesus moments all around us and inside of us. No, I didn't say we can always feel it, but it's there. Those with mental health struggles, along with the beautiful variety of identities and challenges, see, they are the church. They teach us love. We are the church. We can teach love. So, do me a favor. No, do yourselves a favor. Let's each start taking stock of our faith communities. Are we really welcoming and honoring those with physical and mental health challenges? Or is our patience quickly fraying at the edges with no end in sight? Are we finding ourselves praying to change others and wanting to make them, quote, whole? Let us instead pray that with us and in our presence, they already feel affirmed of their wholeness. Not that they feel whole with us, but are reaffirmed in their God-given wholeness, complete and already beautiful. Let us, and here's the hard part, with humility, seek to convey that we need the wisdom and sacred spirit that these people, our siblings, bring to our lives exactly as they are. Blessings and namaste. Amen.